A reading from Exodus. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbors in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat of it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire, with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. The word of the Lord. A reading from 1 Corinthians. I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." The word of the Lord.
The Holy Gospel according to John. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are the messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of the Lord. I fear that our Lenten meditations on love may be getting somewhat redundant. But then, the Bible is really redundant about love, especially the writings of John, especially the words of Jesus. Again and again and again, we hear a call to love God and love others. Apparently, you can't say it enough or hear it enough. In fact, in our gospel reading today, Jesus made it a command. On Maundy Thursday, Jesus' last Thursday alive, Jesus had dinner with his disciples. He washed their feet and talked about serving others. He talked about his imminent betrayal. One of those sitting at the table with him, Judas, left the dinner to actually do that. Then Jesus gave his disciples a new commandment. The Latin word for commandment is mandatum. That's why we call this Maundy Thursday. It's literally Commandment Thursday. The new commandment Jesus gave to love one another was to love one another as Jesus loved them. It wasn't an entirely new commandment, though. From the beginning, God's people were called to love one another. The last 6 of the 10 commandments given to Moses 1,200 years before Jesus gave his commandment were aimed at that. Don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't covet. Earlier in his own ministry, Jesus had affirmed that the 2 most important commandments were to love God and to love others. Earlier in his ministry, Jesus had talked about not only loving neighbors, but also enemies. He talked about love as a way of being and doing in the world. He taught about love being the sign of true discipleship. What made the Thursday Mandatum new was the part about loving as Jesus loved and loves. There are some words and actions at the supper that tell us some of what that means. But the whole New Testament is actually focused on that redundantly. Again and again and again, the New Testament calls us to love God and to love one another as Jesus loved. So what do we find there? We find that Jesus' love was adventurous. He left his home and his family and everything he knew out of love. He went to foreign lands where he was a stranger. He set out alone, not knowing where he would go, who he would meet. He would have to engage people in relationships. He would have to speak out in public. He was young and had a mission for the whole world with only his love of God and others to guide him. Jesus' love was active. He didn't just talk about love, he loved. He served. He acted on his compassion. He healed the sick. He fed the hungry. He blessed the children. He raised the dead. He washed his disciples' feet. He spoke for the oppressed. Whenever love presented an opportunity, Jesus seized it. He was never too busy or too tired. He never wondered if he had the right talents. He never discounted the effect that one person could have on the world. Jesus' love was bold and courageous. Sometimes he broke the law, like when he healed someone on the Sabbath or let his disciples gather food on the Sabbath. Jesus' love transcended all the rules and laws. He didn't worry about how his actions were going to be interpreted by others. He didn't care what others thought of him. He didn't care about what he should or shouldn't do. He cared about people. He cared about loving them. Jesus' love had no boundaries. He bestowed dignity and love on women and children and pagans and foreigners. He didn't acknowledge medical or religious taboos. He was at home with sinners. Loving the world for Jesus meant loving the world. Women, men, children, Jews, Gentiles, Samaritans, healthy, sick, prostitute, tax collector, neighbor, enemy. Every person. Jesus' love was selfless. He never asked what love would do for him. He certainly could have expected or asked to be served in many ways, but he didn't. Sometimes people love because it brings love back to them, or because it makes them feel good, or because not loving would make them feel bad. Sometimes people enter relationships mainly to be loved or to be served. Not Jesus. Jesus loved because he was love. Even when those he loved betrayed him or denied him or failed him, he went right on loving them. Jesus' love was understanding. People did fail and deny and betray him. And Jesus understood that sometimes people are like that. That's sin. And sin is the reason Jesus was in the world. He didn't expect others to be sinless. He just loved them like they were. His eyes were wide open. He knew people weren't perfect, but he loved them perfectly. Jesus' love was sacrificial. Maybe we too often think of love as something that makes us feel good. Jesus' love often brought pain into his life. and often made difficult demands on his life. For Jesus, love meant finally being willing to die. If that's what it took to love and save sinners, well, Jesus loved them to the end. Jesus' love was forgiving. He even forgave those who killed him. For all the failures of the world, Jesus held nothing against anyone. He just continued to love to the end, which actually there isn't an end. But more about that tomorrow and Sunday. Amen.